Good morning, everybody. I guess I'll take this off. We got to talking with the group here. So once again, I would really promote people coming in person because you actually get to see people. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. But before I do, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are located in Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. So Janice Miyazaki is not a stranger to most people on the call here, but in this role, many of you will know she took over as our Department of Medicine Director for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and really has done a lot of good work to get us started. And so we thought it would be really helpful to present some of that here and really get some feedback, I think, more than anything else. And so I'll just say that, of course, Dr. Miyazaki is our first director of EDI. She's our current section chief and division director for the Division of Neurology. And she has a very brief bio here that says she's published works on EDI since 2018, including the progress of women in neurology at the American Academy of Neurology. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Janice.
Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to speak. So this is the sweetgrass bear, and it on its statue on the pedestal, it says, "We are all human and connected." And I think that that is a lovely sentiment for us to embrace as we're listening to this talk. And also, I want to say that it's been 9 years since I came from Toronto. And everyone has been so kind and so welcoming to me. And I never felt like an outsider, even though you probably said, "Oh my God, she's from Toronto. She might be aggressive and obnoxious." But you actually embraced me. And this is also what EDI is about. Even though we're fearful or we don't know, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to believe that they have good intention, and to want to help them belong. So the objectives are to be able to list 3 main findings of the Department of Medicine EDI survey, to list 3 actions that the DOM will undertake in the next 3 years, 3 is a good number, to improve EDI in the Department of Medicine, and some resources that you can use on your own to increase awareness of EDI issues. There we go. So a lot of people wonder, what is implicit bias? And I'm going to just play this little video, and hopefully it works because we had to use a different format.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10p. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10p. The answer is actually 5p. Many of us choose 10p without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social, and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now, because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it. We're done.
And I think that video sort of highlights how many institutions are trying to address this. They talked about the selection process, and they talked about members of the selection committee who actually have a lot of power being aware of their bias and being free to monitor each other. This means not calling out people, but calling them in. So the difference is, instead of calling out people and going, "You're biased," instead saying, "You know, I wonder if we have considered all the facts here." And that's a kinder way, actually, for us all to improve. And so some of the comments in the survey, I'm going to address in background information. So one of the comments was, there is no bias based on gender or gender identity. So women in health sciences are less likely to receive faculty appointments, less likely to obtain leadership positions, earn a comparable salary. Women physicians generally earn less than male physicians with similar qualifications, are less likely to receive grant funding, less likely to be first or last author, less likely to publish in top-tier peer-reviewed journals, and more likely to leave the academy prematurely. This was in 2019. And I will tell you a story of one of my colleagues. Her name is A.M. Barrett. And A.M. could not get a grant. She could not get any of her papers published until she stopped submitting her papers as Anne. She started submitting them as A.M. And to this day, she is known as A.M. And all of a sudden, A.M.'s grants and papers were worthy. This is a sad comment, but it is part of the difficulties of the peer review process. So the Canadian demographics are 70% of the population self-identify as white, 5% Indigenous, and 26.5% belong to a non-white and non-Indigenous minority. However, 35.5% report multiple ethnicities. And so this is also something that we're going to have to be aware of, that sometimes we make assumptions about people's ethnicities, their backgrounds, their experiences, and really we don't know anything about them. In Edmonton in 2016, 37% of the population were non-white and non-Indigenous. So this is a fairly high proportion and sort of similar to the rest of Canada. However, diversity in leadership in Alberta compared to Black, Indigenous, or Pacific Islander Asian physicians, white participants were overrepresented in leadership positions and academic roles. Cisgender women had less often applied for academic promotion than cisgender men, and BIPOC physicians have been denied promotion more frequently. 7.7% versus 4.4%. And this was in 2022 by Shannon Ruzicki, who's doing some amazing work in Calgary. Also from Shannon and Silverberg, the proportion of female recipients of residence selected awards across Canada. So we often think that our residents perhaps have a better lens than we do, but in fact, male staff and resident physicians had 3 times greater likelihood of receiving teaching awards given by residents than female staff physicians. And Ruzicki again and colleagues studied the prevalence and characteristics of anti-Indigenous bias among Albertan physicians, a cross-sectional survey, and 375 practicing physicians in Alberta responded. This is just through people who I believe were licensed through CPSA. 8.3% felt unfavorably towards Indigenous people, 25% preferred white people to Indigenous people, and 2/3 had an implicit anti-Indigenous bias. White cisgender men physicians had the greatest implicit preferences, and free text responses discussed reverse racism targeting white people so that white people are now more disadvantaged. So the survey that we took, we sent out a survey to everyone in the Department of Medicine. This includes all our support staff, our residents, and the initial invitation was on October 20th, with reminders on October 4th and 18th, and we had the amazing response rate of 273 respondents, 6 of which I think were on the EDI committee. So it's not a great response rate, but I think that's fairly typical for the surveys that go out, especially during COVID when we were all just so burned out and not very happy about a lot of things. So who answered the survey? You can see here that 30% were AMHSP faculty that, oh, they didn't give the percentage here of our clinical academic colleagues. We had scientists responding, our support staff, and 19% were trainees. And among the faculty demographics, that 60% of the faculty were 60% of respondents said it was not applicable. Only 10% were tenure track, 20% were tenured, and 10% were non-tenured. The age range, you can see here with the greatest proportion being in the 40 to 59 group. And the gender identity, you can see that there were 32% men, and the percentage again is cut off, but more women responded than men. And this is also common in EDI surveys because they have something to say. We also asked about ethnicity and identification, and you can see that there were 6 respondents who were Métis and 1 who's preferred not to answer. And these were the different ethnicities, and this was based on the Canadian labor groupings of ethnicities. People had some difficulties with this, but this was actually taken from a government method of identifying. And we also wanted to know how confident were our faculty in the concepts of EDI and teaching EDI. So we asked, how confident are you with the concepts? And you can see that 16% were very confident, and 60% were 16 were very confident, and 60% were confident. And about teaching learners, that now 30% were confident, and only 7.8% were very confident. And in terms of formal education and EDI, which did not include the mandatory modules from the Faculty of Medicine because they're quite brief and really I wouldn't qualify them as formal education. Only 21.6% had formal education. And then if you recall, those 273 of us who answered the survey, some of the questions: have you personally experienced racism or other forms of discrimination, which could include remarks, actions, access to resources, or opportunities? And notice it wasn't about just ethnicity or gender identification. It could be about ableism. It could be about your size. You know, people, I think bias against people who are heavier is the last acceptable bias in society. So it was just discrimination in any form. And you can see that there is, you know, it's not high, but it's more than what we want. We want it to be 0. And it's 17% and 10% throughout here. And at AHS facilities, you can see 14%, 13%, and 7.8% in the last 6 to 10 years. And at Covenant Health, this was very striking, that there were very few people who experienced discrimination or bias at Covenant Health facilities. It was markedly different than the AHS facilities. And witnessing other forms of discrimination, you can see, was even higher. Or discrimination against others in AHS facilities was higher. And we asked this question because often when we discuss this with AHS, they said, well, you never asked about AHS facilities specifically. So it could have been all at the university. So now we have this data, it's happening at AHS facilities. And racism or other forms of discrimination at Covenant Health, and you can see how much lower it is. That's a huge difference. Have others disclosed to you? And this is even higher. So other people are disclosing to faculty members or other members in the Department of Medicine that they have experienced discrimination or bias. And I think 28% in the last year, that's really very high. And when we look at the sources of racism or discrimination, sadly, we see that it's other faculty. Nurses, other healthcare team members, administration, patients were very high, family members of patients. And the quantitative results in summary were assistant professors were more likely to report experiencing racism, discrimination, or bias, speaking to their less powerful position. Women reported significantly more racism, discrimination, or bias than men, 39% versus 25%, so that is significant. Racism, discrimination, or bias was reported by more people working at AHS versus Covenant Health. And look at those numbers, 23% versus 11% for men, and 38.9% versus 21% for women. So I often call the Grey Nuns my happy little place for neurology. I guess it really is true that it's happy in many other ways too. Respondents, and a better coffee place. Respondents overall felt very confident or confident with EDI concepts, 76%, and teaching these concepts, 38%, but fewer than 21% had formal education on EDI. So again, speaking to, sometimes I think, you know, we're doctors and we feel we have to fix everything, but maybe we have to look at ourselves and do some education first before we try to fix. So here are some qualitative examples And this was the biggest node that was coded. I don't want to see that P blank, blank, blank doctor who sometimes works with you from a patient. So much racism in the department and faculty of medicine, and no one ever addressed it. I'm tired of it. Remember that there is also a fear of discrimination that may preclude disclosure. So fear of disclosure and fear of retaliation or that meaningful change does not happen was common. And, you know, sometimes we think, I'll know it when I see it, sort of like they say pornography, you know it when you see it. But as we know, depending on your point of view, you may not be seeing it and seeing the whole picture, and you may be labeling it as something else. And we're going to see some examples of that. I haven't experienced overtly racist actions or remarks, but some minor things that are generally insensitive, assumptions related to my appearance or race. I would say that is actually racist. A patient commented on the resident's origin. We debriefed afterwards. He said he did not feel that the comment was racist, but I was not comfortable. So even when individuals receive the racist comments, they may have internalized these views and failed to recognize it as such. And a learner is vulnerable and unlikely to admit that they felt discriminated against by a patient or uncomfortable with it. So really asking them is not going to yield, yes, I felt that was really mean. You know, I felt differently towards the patient. And for the preceptor to maybe say, that's not an acceptable statement. Many reported on behalf of learners or colleagues, so sexism was the next largest node coded. A group of female learners have felt discriminated against and lacked mentorship opportunities due to their gender. Male colleagues treat them differently and would not feel comfortable having them as mentees. A junior colleague, she was uncomfortable when a senior colleague wanted their research meetings to take place in the evenings at a restaurant. Providing feedback on behalf of an entire division, but the female faculty member was singled out as being more harsh by the learners. I have seen a senior faculty colleague giving presentation at division rounds with nude art in the slides and commenting how much he really appreciates women. I think it may have been well-meaning, but I felt uncomfortable. I will just say that is not acceptable or appropriate in an academic talk unless it's on Renaissance art. We need to separate intent from impact, regardless of the intentions. If those in the audience felt uncomfortable, it's probably not appropriate. Education efforts should focus on setting explicit boundaries for interactions between individuals with a power differential, and the more senior or powerful individual must take responsibility for appropriate behavior. Other nodes that we're seeing were ageism, bias against parents, against healthcare workers in general, physical disabilities, weight, and religion. 4 respondents wrote the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry recognizes diversity only when it surrounds Indigenous students. 1 respondent felt that gender identity was not relevant and did not disclose, and we see from the background information that it's very relevant in the 2020s. 1 respondent felt that misogyny and ageism are acceptable as normal and anti-white behavior where Caucasians are considered not to have valid opinions or excluded based on their lack for perceived relevant diversity was happening. And I think the important thing to take from this is that there's a lot of fear, but we want everyone to belong. Going forward does not mean that we actually start to exclude a different group of people. It means that we just want everyone to feel they have a place and to feel that they have an equal opportunity to move forward and to be everything they can be in their professional and personal lives. So moving forward, because I was very stung by that comment, I've answered lots of these surveys and nothing happens, but we're going to make something happen. So we're having a call to action that is based on education and communication, and to encourage the use of existing reporting mechanisms, engage the leaders of the Department of Medicine, and these actions were approved by the steering committee. So implicit bias training required for all search and selection, CARM selection, and faculty with CAC appointment and AMHSP members, researchers, and employees, and trying to do this as they're onboarded so that they feel that this is part of their responsibility to inform themselves. Development of anti-racist and bias education for residency half days, and this is already taking place in many of the divisions. Requirement of at least one presentation per year in the Department of Medicine on language surrounding EDI, intersectionality of bias, and the impact on health. Because in the end, we all want to be excellent physicians. And so being aware of our biases is part of that when we're interacting with such a diverse population of people who, we come from such privilege now as physicians to remember that not everyone has. The Department of Medicine's members applying for leadership positions must complete the anti-racism E-class course and provide evidence of completion with their application. So again, because we take our tone from the top. So if our leaders are embracing these values, then we're more likely to have it go through the entire Department of Medicine. To collect demographic data regarding speakers at medical grand rounds and award recipients, and to review the diversity of speakers and award recipients. This is, again, not to exclude people, but I was on the education committee for an international group, and they kept recycling the same speakers. And I said, you got to put your fishing pole in a different pond if you want to catch different fish. And I think that's part of what we need to do when we're thinking about speakers. Cast your fishing rod in a different pond that doesn't look like you and see what you can get. You'll be amazed at the talent that is out there among our colleagues. To endorse the steering committee to endorse the value of EDI and participate in EDI activities fully and wholeheartedly. I didn't put that in there, but that's what I would like. Because when a leader rolls their eyes, when they hear EDI, it sends a message. It sends a very strong message. I don't believe in this. So the leaders must not roll their eyes. They must really embrace this. To review the language of policy, guidelines, procedures for hiring, and CARM selection for inclusive practice. And you heard from Lindsay Bridgeland about the efforts that she's making, and it's just amazing what she's doing. Track time to promotion and demographics and identification to ensure that, unlike what Shannon found in her research, that we are not denying promotions at a higher rate to people who are of different ethnicities. Access medical staff funds to support research and events promoting EDI, and ensure inclusion of graduate and postdoctoral trainees because they're often missing in the educational efforts for EDI, and I think they would like it. To consider awards for anti-racism research, education, or advocacy in the Department of Medicine. And then here are some excellent resources for EDI. I know everyone says there's problems with the Harvard implicit bias test. Yes, but every time I say, do you have a better resource? Nobody is able to come up with one. So I just take one every 6 months. And I take a different one because they're always adding on modules. And it's helpful for me to take my pulse of where I am. And finally, I would like to thank the EDI committee and our administrative support Gloria, who is just wonderful and kept us all on track. And now I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jenna. I do need to put in a very quick plug in terms of activities. If for those of you who actually open up our newsletter, Dr. Tim Chan has actually started a new parents group for all new parents in the department. And so if you get a chance, I think we'll post it again in the next newsletter. But just in terms of starting on some of these activities, I mean, you know, you don't know that there is a group there that isn't being represented until people speak up and identify that you know, this is potentially an area. And I think there is a lot to be shared as well. So I just wanted to put that plug in when you mentioned that. I will open it up to questions. Sorry, I'm just trying to make
So I
sure.
found your anecdote interesting about your colleague that changed her name and AM. So do you recommend to women that they change their publishing credentials to their initials?
You know, I have not done that, but I will say that I have received very harsh reviews from reviewer number 2. It's always reviewer number 2. And it was unprofessional, actually. And I doubt that males had ever received anything like that, because I did show it to a lot of my male colleagues and they're like, oh my goodness, that is like beyond the pale. I was surprised when Anne told me this. Well, AM told me this. I don't know. I don't know what is the right answer. At this point, I publish under my own name. People recognize my name. And so, you know, they write down, this is by a giant in neuropalliative care. I'm like, woo. But it took a long time and it took a lot of rejection to get to that point. So I don't know what the right answer is for the people starting off.
So let's start with Penny and then I'll go through these.
Yeah, I was so struck by your difference between the Covenant Health facilities and the AHS facilities. And it made me think sometimes of the disconnect between the organization's values and mission compared to what is actually experienced in the workplace. Because I think Covenant gets a little bit of a bad rap right now because a lot of its values and mission, if you look at it, is steeped in Catholicism and it very explicitly, right? And then there's this history of Catholicism, and then, I mean, we all know how that has been associated with certain groups, like especially Indigenous and things, whereas AHS doesn't have any of that. Oh, no.
It's a very long question, so I'm just going to move to Penny.
No, well,
it
it's a
was
good
the-
commentary.
It was the difference between Covenant Health and AHS reporting. And she had very good points about Covenant Health sometimes being looked down upon because many of their policies and values are steeped in Catholicism
And the historical nature of Catholicism and discrimination against certain groups. So I just wanted to know how we tackle that, like, and that's a big question without a clear answer, because obviously what's happening on the ground is a bit different than what is explicitly expressed in our organization's values and missions, right? Like in both ways, in different places.
Yeah, so I think actually there is,
In Covenant Health, they do talk about everyone belonging. They do talk about that in their values, because I looked at it after I saw these results. And it also, to be fair, there's smaller facilities. So you know everyone, and it's a community, and they have this incredibly strong sense of loyalty and community.
And a doctor's lounge.
And a doctor's lounge with awesome sofas, recliners, and coffee, free coffee. If anyone from administration and operations is listening. But no, they have this incredible sense of loyalty and community there. And it goes throughout everything. When you see them, even when I toured, because I toured all the hospitals when I took over as DG, And the nurses, the way they talk about the doctors, and the doctors, the way they talk about the nurses, and the allied health, the way they talk about the whole team, and they just love each other. It's really perplexing coming from UAH. I think it's that size and that community that they've been able to foster. Whereas at UA, it's very large. So it's easy to be anonymous. It's easy to be, kind of let your ugly get out on a bad day. And you think, I'm never going to see this person, or I'll rarely see this person, right? Whereas at Covenant Health, you're going to see that person in 3 more weeks. So it's a very different environment. And I was struck by that as well. Like there's so many different factors that could play into the differences.
Well, you started your talk with the feeling connected and related, right? And so I mean, I had the good fortune of doing my rotating internship many years ago, and at the Grey Nuns, and it's just, it is that community feel, whether it's the doctor's lounge or whatever it is that allows that connectedness, right? Before I go there, there is a question about the level of diversity at Covenant sites. Is it similar to AHS? We have no reason to believe it's not. I mean, it's representative of the wider Edmonton community, so I would suspect it is. Okay, before I go to online questions, I'll let you answer.
Dr. Brevish from Grey Nuns, Wednesday's update.
Thank you for the great talk and the support with research. So I did my fellowship here, and I'm working both at the Ves and the greenhouse for probably the last 5 years. And one I think, I mean, I like what you say is the degree of collegiality, and you notice it, like it's very, very friendly environment, and even like our urology department, like even the extracurricular activities that we do and other social events that we do definitely foster and the bonding, and it's very, very comfortable environment work. And I have noticed it the same both at the Ves and at the Grey Nuns. And I think the background of the Catholicism is not clean in the work environment there, other than it's more kind of fair, friendly work environment. That's my impression. It's very, very comfortable. Yeah.
And certain procedures. Yes. Okay, so the first one here is an anonymous writer writes, how about stop rewarding senior leaders in awards and chairs? We have found EDI is more common in ECR, in early career researchers and mid-career staff. I don't know what that means. EDI is more common. Point number 2 is have grad trainees coordinate the research days meetings. And point number 3 is force all grants to meaningfully include early career and mid-career investigators. So I think these are just some suggestions.
Yeah, I think it is very hard in Canada to get a CIHR grant, isn't it? I mean, the amount of, when I look at the early 80s, when the acceptance rate was like 20-30%, I was like, man, I was born in the wrong era. And now it's below 7%. So there is great science in Canada that does not receive grants. And there is this tendency that once you get on that CIHR wagon, you sort of understand how things work, and you're more likely to get a grant because you had a grant before. So I totally agree with this. We have to give opportunities for our younger investigators so that they continue their love of science.
For those who don't know, that this cycle of CRCs, at least the tier 2, are very specific in terms of the audience they're targeting, just because, and it's, I'll tell an anecdote sometime in the future or if there's time later, but it's very clear that there are certain groups that don't see themselves reflected in what a CRC chair looks like, and so just don't apply for them. So this round is actually targeting a very specific group. Quentin asks, says, thanks for the presentation. Can you provide data on Department of Medicine people having English as a first language versus other languages? We didn't ask that.
Yes, we did. That is in the data. I would have to dig back, but I can get back to you on that.
Quentin, she'll get back to you. Karen Lee, thanks for the insightful presentation. There is a Social Accountability Advisory Committee in FOMD that I was asked to join, that's chaired by Catherine Dong. Is the Department of Medicine EDI committee connecting with this new FOMD committee as well?
Sure.
I mean, I think if I can comment, Karen, we've really tried within the department not to reinvent the wheel. And Janice, I think, was very mindful of that. And that's why we started with this survey, is because feeling that we need to see what's out there, see what we need within our department. And that's why the call to action, which we will share with you somewhere along the line, either in a newsletter or something, or in a memo, so that we can get some more feedback on it and then consider it adopted. So just to Karen's point. Richard asks, can you comment on bias in research papers? I think, yeah, you can go ahead and add to it, but he says CIHR is still the leader in this. Still, it sometimes is overlooked.
Yeah, so Richard and I were, if it's Richard Camatroli, Richard and I noted that in dementia studies, there's a paucity of women and overrepresentation of men by the percentages. And what we noticed as we were recruiting for specific studies was that the female spouses tended to say to the patient who's male, you are going to participate in that research study, it is good. Whereas the male spouses often said, I can't do that. So we actually feel that it may have something to do with your support. And so there are many studies where there is underrepresentation of women. We struggle to recruit people of different ethnicities. None of our studies ever approach Canadian demographics. It is very rare. We have looked at our deep brain stimulation population, and that was the basis of Fang Ba's SHIRK grant. And we found that there was 80% of our recipients were white males. And that is clearly not the demographics of the illnesses that we are treating. And our DBS team is almost uniformly not white. So just having the team as not white doesn't make a difference. And we wonder if the patients who are getting streamed to us are different. And so we're looking at that further. We're also looking at whether the university itself may not be entirely hospitable to people who are new immigrants and may not speak the language. They may feel very intimidated coming to the university, and what we can do to make it better and to communicate better the opportunities for them to have improved health. So yes, I think there's a great opportunity in all our specialties to look at how we can be better in our research as well.
And our clinical care, right? I mean, Nazia Sharpagin, who was a trainee here, is now in Toronto, did these great studies with that little, robot interpreter thing, that just bringing that in made such a big difference in terms of clinical care. I mean, we do have these tools, but we tend to forget to use them.
Mm-hmm.
Brian Rowe just wanted to correct that recent CIHR successes are actually greater than 15%, with 24% being the highest. It's never been 7%, never been 7%. Lowest ever was 9% in 2016.
Okay, 9%.
So
9%.
Okay, so there's a question about, can residents be included in the parent group? I absolutely think so. There is, like I said, we'll send the link out. There is no omissions whatsoever, but she makes a really good point here that this would also increase a sense of community and help break down some of those hierarchies that are isolating. It may be open to us, but wasn't sure. So we should just be more explicit about having learners included in some of these, I guess not necessarily, internal type of committees. So Pam brought up an interesting point similar to what Karen said, that there are equity, diversity, inclusion type committees, both here at the university, within the faculty, as well as at AHS. And it would be important for us to share some of these findings with them. So you have a smile, so tell us about that.
I have not approached them. Yes, I'd be happy to share that with them.
Well, I think it's important for them to hear. I
Yeah.
mean, it is a Department of Medicine perspective, so
But there's no reason to believe that it's any different in other specialties, right?
Yeah.
Like this is, I
agreed.
think, yeah.
If anything, we may have a little bit, I guess, smaller community and yeah. Sorry, the second part of the question, earlier question was CARM self-identification questionnaire. Does anybody know about that? The CARM, apparently you have to you can self-identify in the CARMS questionnaire. I didn't know about that. But we'll see if we have. a
Yeah,
chance to let
so
this
those
off.
are interesting about self-identification questionnaires. And I will tell you that in the 90s, when I first started off in practice, I probably would not have answered, even though my name is so obviously Japanese. But I would not have answered because I would be afraid that that would single me out. And so I think self-identification questionnaires are okay, as long as the purpose of the self-identification questionnaire is very clear to the respondents. If you are doing it to check off a box that, hey, look how many, people were getting placed into residencies, that's kind of self-serving. If it is to ensure that the practices are fair and equitable, that's something different and higher. So I think that any questionnaire for self-identification has to be clear about why you're asking.
Good point. Lindsay just want to make a comment more than anything else that with respect to the name changing affecting acceptance of manuscripts, she said there was a non-medical study in the US that showed when a person had a name that was non-white, they were much less likely to get a job. If the name was white sounding on the exact same CV, then more jobs or interviews were offered.
Yeah, so that study, actually, there's several studies that have various themes, but in fact, probably the most egregious finding was that CVs with resumes with Black sounding names of males were less likely, who were law-abiding and had never been arrested, were less likely to get a call back for an interview than white-sounding names of convicts who freely identified that they had been in jail.
Watch out for Jeffrey Dahmer's applying for a job. And then lastly, Karen asks if we track sociodemographic profiles, and just to say that if you look at the call to action, one of the things that we've identified, or the group has identified, is at least for leadership positions, for various awards and those types of things, there's a plan to sort of put all of that information together and track it that way. Yeah, we have easy access to that type of information, but I would, I'd just be careful about how we're using it before we start deciding that we're going to be tracking it, as Janice says. So, okay, any other last minute? Oh, Karen, yeah.
Interesting, because you went on about how you wouldn't have answered that survey. And I think when people and even on there were some of those questions that would prefer not to answer. I think that probably means people are afraid to say, because of they're afraid of discrimination in some way. Like you said, you didn't want to answer those surveys. So how do we, if you track these things, people might try to fit in, right? To try to be part of the group and maybe hide some of those differences they might perceive that people would discriminate based on.
Well, the only way to improve things is through trust. And you earn trust. And clearly, for at least 20 to 30% of the Department of Medicine, we have not earned their trust. We have not provided an environment where they do not hear it, do not have it reported to them, do not experience it. And we need to become that place so that people feel more free to identify and know that they will be accepted and not prematurely judged.
Thanks, Janice. On behalf of the department, I would like to just take this opportunity to sincerely thank you for this work. I'm really excited. We do have a plan in place for how to move forward. Have identified some resources to ensure that we can at least address most of those things over the next 3 years, right? 3 is the magic number. But I think Janice is open to feedback, and so just reach out to her or any one of the committee members. And we look forward to great things and an update to come. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.